chapter 15, verse 16. Let us hear these words. The soldiers led Jesus away into the palace and called together the whole company of soldiers. They put a purple robe on him, then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him. And they began to call out to him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Again and again they struck him on the head with a staff and spit on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes on him. And they led him out to crucify him. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. The word of the Lord. It was certainly a day that changed the world. As we have over these last weeks retraced the steps of Jesus, we are reminded how powerful this story is and the reality of God's love in the midst of all of it, and how the reality of that love continues to change and transform lives each and every day. And today, in this passage, we see how on this dreadful day that Mark retraces, leading to Golgotha, how it changed one man's life forever, and I believe challenges us even to be changed as well. His name was Simon. Simon. His name meant God has heard. And today would certainly seem that God had heard his many, many prayers. Today was the day that he and his two boys would finally get to see Jerusalem, the mighty and holy city of God, with their own eyes. And all of his life, he had dreamed of this day when he would get to enter into the gates of Jerusalem. You might say that Jerusalem was Simon's most favorite place in the world, even though he had never been there before. But God had heard his prayers, and now not only was he there in Jerusalem, but he was there with his two sons during one of the most amazing times. It was Passover. Historians estimate that as many as 100,000 pilgrims would come to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover in Simon's day. And many would attend the festival every year. However, for Simon, it was for him a once-in-a-lifetime dream come true. The fact that Simon was there was really no small feat. You see, Simon was from the city of Cyrene, which was the capital city of the district of Phoenicia in northern Africa, and there were many Jews in Cyrene. And over the centuries, hardship and warfare had forced many Jews to flee and spread all over the northern Africa, the Mediterranean, and throughout Central Europe. And at the time that Simon lived there, the Jewish population in Cyrene numbered into the tens of thousands. And even so, his people were still in minority in the area. But ever since he was a boy, Simon and his family observed Passover. And each year, he would be mesmerized by the story. And at the end of every Passover celebration, Simon and his family would always declare, next year in Jerusalem, next year in Jerusalem. It was a dream. He could picture it in his mind. He didn't have picture books or postcards or the internet to show him these images of what Jerusalem looked like, but all he had were simply the descriptions that he heard from his neighbors or the townfolk who had actually gone to Jerusalem and had actually seen the temple there. They would describe their experience in vivid detail. And Simon would listen intently. He would hang on their every word. Just to see Jerusalem would have been a dream come true. But to be there during Passover, well, that didn't even dare to think that that would even become a possible thing. Next year in Jerusalem. That sounded so wonderful. The only problem was that Jerusalem was some 800 miles away. So to make such a pilgrimage would take a lot of time, and it would cost a lot of money. But Simon was determined to see his dream come to reality. So he began to do what anybody would do. He began to save, and eventually his pouch became so heavy and full enough for him to make the trip. In fact, enough for him and his 2 sons to go with him. And so finally, the day of departure came. It was a month before Passover. It might only take a few weeks to reach Jerusalem, but he wanted to add in some extra time in case there was any trouble or delay. He wasn't going to let anything get in the way of this pilgrimage. So Simon and his sons packed up what they could carry, and they set off. The city of Cyrene was located along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, so the route was pretty straightforward. Simon went to the city docks and he booked passage on a ship that was sailing to Joppa, which was located on the Palestinian coast. And once they reached Joppa, Simon and his sons would then walk some 35 miles inland to the city of Jerusalem. Now, most of the people on the ship were crew, but several others were there, were fellow pilgrims who were going to Jerusalem for the Passover as well. And some of them had been there before. So as they passed time on that long days on the ship, they told Simon and his sons a bit about what to expect. They described it in perfect detail. After stopping at several ports to load and unload cargo and passengers, they finally docked in Joppa and they began their walk to Jerusalem. It was now 2 days before the Passover, just enough time to make the 2-day walk to Jerusalem. On the first day, Simon and his sons linked up with some of the other pilgrims, and they made camp just right outside of Jerusalem. The roads were a little too dangerous to travel alone or at night, but the next morning at the first crack of the first daylight, when it was bright enough to see the road, Simon and his sons hit the road and they headed east toward their long-awaited goal, Jerusalem. So along the dusty road, his eyes would strain as he would look into the distance ahead to catch his first glimpse of the holy city of God. Jerusalem set up on a hill, but mountains also surrounded it. So when Simon turned a corner and finally got to see his first good look at Jerusalem, he was not just looking at the city, but he was looking down on it. And it was magnificent. It was more beautiful and more breathtaking than he could have ever imagined. And right there in the very middle of it all was God's house, the temple. Simon covered the last mile as fast as his feet could carry him. And the closer he got to the city, the more crowded the road became. And finally, there he was at the western gate, passing through the gate and entering the city. And soon he found himself caught up in the flow of the crowd, and he was walking past shops and vendors along the narrow streets. And he kept reminding his sons to stay close to his side. The sights and the smells, the crowds, it was everything that he had imagined it would be and more. And as he tried to take it all in, he heard the sound of a disturbance. There was a disturbance up ahead. And people were shouting and moving to the sides of the street to let what appeared to be some kind of procession squeeze through. Neither his stomach nor his eyes were prepared for what he saw. 3 men, beaten and bloody, staggering and struggling as they tried to carry these huge wooden beams on their shoulders. And one of them had what looked like a wreath made of thorns pressed on top of his head, and his face was covered in blood. And several Roman soldiers were shouting at them and pushing them and occasionally striking them across their backs and legs with whips. He involuntarily winced every time he heard the sound of their whips cracking and striking the human flesh and the men groaning in pain, too weak to cry out. Simon was horrified by the sight. This was supposed to be a happy trip. This was the dream trip, the bucket list, Passover in Jerusalem. And now he has to step aside for what could only be described as a death march. And he recognized these wooden beams that they were carrying and realized that they were on their way somewhere outside of the city to be crucified. The anger of the crowd was palatable. The intense shouts and the jeers of the crowd seemed to be primarily directed towards the man who was bringing up the end of the procession, the one who was wearing the crown of thorns. And he appeared to be in the worst shape of all three, barely able to put one foot in front of the other. The weight of this wooden crossbeam too much for him to carry. And a Roman soldier walked in front of him carrying this sign that was written on it. It said, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." And the sign puzzled Simon. He hadn't heard that there was a new king of the Jews. As far as he knew, Herod still had that title. And yet, if this poor soul were the king of the Jews, why was he so beaten and bloody? And why was everyone shouting and cursing him and calling for his death? The king of the Jews staggered and then dropped to his knees. And the Roman guards showed him no mercy. And they beat him and kicked him until he slowly dragged himself back up to his feet. It was a horrible thing to see. Simon had never seen anything so cruel in all his life. Simon turned to an old man that was standing next to him and asked him, he said, "Why is everyone so upset with this man? What has he done to deserve this brutal treatment and such scorn from the crowd?" And the old man replied, "Have you not heard of the prophet from Nazareth named Jesus? Today he's being crucified. If he's a prophet," Simon asked, "what crime has he committed that is so horrible that he deserves crucifixion?" And the old man's head just dropped, along with his voice. "This man has committed no crimes. You see the sign. The religious leaders consider him a threat because he said he's the Messiah, the promised anointed one sent from God. They say that he is guilty of great, unspeakable blasphemy." Their conversation was interrupted, and Simon looked up to see what had happened. This Jesus of Nazareth had fallen again and was practically laying at his feet. And before Simon had time to assess the situation, one of the Roman guards grabbed him by the neck and ordered him to pick up the bloody wooden crossbeam lying at his feet. He looked back at the terrified faces of his two sons, who watched helplessly as the guard began to shove their father down the street with this huge, blood-soaked piece of lumber on his shoulders. They pressed their way through the screaming crowds, trying to keep their eyes on their father so they would not get lost. Why did Simon, get tagged for this horrific chore? Jesus had fallen at his feet. Did the guard choose him simply because he was the only one at that particular spot who looked strong enough to carry such a heavy piece of wood the rest of the way to Golgotha? Was it bad luck? Was it circumstance? Or was he chosen? Not by the guard, but by God. However it happened, it happened. Simon didn't have a choice. A soldier with a whip and a sword ordered him to carry this poor man's crossbeam. And all of a sudden, Simon found himself playing a principal role in the execution of a man whom he had never met nor ever heard of. What was horrible before got even more horrible, beyond anything he could have ever imagined. The crossbeam was heavy and covered in blood, wet blood from Jesus' wounds, and old, dried-up blood from the victim of previous crucifixions. It was a unique and foul odor. Blood. He had it on his hands, his neck, his clothes, rendering now him unclean and unable to enter the temple. The temple, where he had now scrimped and saved for so many years so that he could worship there. The temple, where he had now traveled for weeks with his sons so that he could be part of the Passover sacrifices and celebrations. Now he was unclean and unable to participate in the Passover as he had planned. And the crowds, the angry crowds calling out for blood, only now they were yelling at him, mistaking him for this Jesus character because he was carrying the bloody crossbeam through the streets of Jerusalem on his way to Golgotha, a place that he had never planned on visiting during his pilgrimage to Jerusalem. How he wished the Roman guard wasn't walking in front of him, making him appear as though he were the criminal. What would those who had seen what happened think? Would they view his actions as involuntary, an act of charity, lending a hand to the Roman soldiers? And what about his sons? They were now witnesses and a part of this too. He couldn't imagine what kind of impression this must be having on his two boys. But what could he do? He had no choice. He had to pick up the crossbeam. He hated to think what would have happened to him and his two boys if he didn't. So he did what he had to. The very place he had always wanted to see was now the very last place on earth he wanted to be. People everywhere. Some leading, some following, some were shouting, a few spat on him, a handful were crying, and there in the middle of it all was Simon, a nameless, unknown pilgrim from Cyrene. Swept up in this insane crowd, he was being led away from the temple to outside the city, from a place of worship and sacrifice and music and celebration and joy to a place of death, a place of execution, a place of sacrifice for the Roman order, a place of deep sadness and grief. As Simon struggled up the hill to Golgotha, Jesus' blood now mingled with his own sweat. He looked over at the condemned man whose cross he was carrying, and he saw the man staring back at him. What he saw in Jesus' eyes would change him forever. He didn't see defeat. He didn't see anger or remorse. What he saw, a strange look of relief, of gratitude maybe. He clearly saw compassion in Jesus' eyes, eyes that seemed to look right into his heart, to penetrate his very soul. Bloody, staggering, barely alive. Could it be that Simon saw love in this man's eyes? When they finally reached the top of Golgotha, the soldiers told Simon he could just drop his burden and leave. The crossbeam hit the ground with a sickening thud, and Simon was free to go, but he didn't. Instead, he drifted back into the crowd that had gathered around Jesus and watched as the soldiers laid Jesus down and spread out his arms and nailed him to the crossbeam. He felt every blow of the hammer as they drove the rough spikes through Jesus' hands. He held his breath as he watched them hoist Jesus up the pole that would now become a cross. He again winced when they grabbed his feet and forced one on top of the other and drove a nail through them. He stood there and listened to the mocking jeers of the crowd as Jesus hung between heaven and earth. And then somehow, drawing strength from somewhere, Jesus cried out, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." and then he breathed his last. Simon left Golgotha. He never made it to the temple. He had seen enough sacrifice for the day. His soul, his heart was troubled. Later that night, Simon noticed something in his hand, a rough splinter that had come off the cross while he was carrying it. And he pulled it out and he wrapped it carefully in a cloth. And when he got home to Cyrene, all of his family and friends asked him about his trip. How could he explain it to them? The memory clung to him, but he had no words to describe it. Just this tiny piece of wood to remind him of that fateful day, a day that he would spend the rest of his life struggling to make sense of. And those eyes. He would never forget those eyes. Simon is mentioned in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But Mark's description is representative of all that we know about Simon of Cyrene. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. Then they brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha. We do not know exactly how long the walk was, nor what Jesus and Simon said or did not say to each other. But we do know that Simon saw how perfect love and perfect grace responded to cruelty and injustice. When Simon woke up that fateful morning, I doubt very much that he expected to carry someone's cross. Do you? To be honest, he never would have carried that cross if he had not been forced to. Would you? And yet, Jesus calls us every day to pick up our cross and follow him. So that's our invitation today, is to pick up our cross and follow wherever Jesus may take us. Because Jesus will go with us. So this morning, as an act of prayer and commitment on our part, our final song, there's a basket of crosses up here. I invite you to come get one as a symbol and a sign. And I invite you to be in a time of prayer, to ask yourself, where is it God might be calling me? What might God be encouraging me to pick up and carry? And how might I let God help me carry this cross?
Christ alone, my hope is found. He is my light, my strength, my song. This cornerstone, this solid ground, firm through the fiercest drought and storm. What heights of love, what depths of peace. Fears are stilled with striving seas. My comfort, all in all, here in the love of Christ I stand. the world my darkness slain, then bursting forth in glorious day, up from the grave he rose again. And as he stands in victory, since curse has lost its grip on me, for I am his and he is mine, bought with the precious blood of Christ. This is the power of Christ in me, from life's first cry to final breath. Jesus commands my destiny. The power of hell, no scheme of mine can never pluck me from his hand till he returns or calls me home. Here in the power of Christ I'll stand. In Christ alone I find my strength. I find my strength, I find my hope, I find my help in Christ alone. When fear assails, when darkness falls, I find my peace in Christ alone. I give my life, I give my all, I sing this song to Christ alone, the King of Kings, the Lord of all heaven sings to Christ alone. In Christ alone. In Christ alone. Sing it till he returns or calls me home. Till he returns or calls me home. Here in the power of Christ I'll stand. Here in the power of Christ